Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here are your hosts, Joe Cirincione and Michelle Dover.
Welcome back. This is the 29th episode of Press the Button. I'm Joe Cirincione.
And I'm Michelle Dover.
And we're both tired today.
I'm a little hoarse.
A little hoarse. I was at the World Series last night, Sunday night, before we were recording this. It was a late night, a grim night for the Nationals, but I had great seats. My friend put me right behind the dugout.
I know. We all saw this when we saw your picture in the paper, D11 of the sports page, for those who are keeping track. You looked gravely concerned.
I was. By the time this podcast drops Tuesday, it'll be a win it or go home game. And maybe if we do win it, then we play it all over again on Wednesday. So the policy news is taking a backseat this weekend to the sports news. But let's get back to the policy.
I know. I mean, we'll be talking about what it means to win on nuclear policy this week.
That's right. We have a great interview with Chairman Adam Smith. He came last week and talked at the National Press Club to our board and donors and members of the national security community. It was a packed house, and he was brilliant, just brilliant. It's so refreshing to have a leading member of Congress talk this candidly to you. You know, he really, when you heard the phrase "truth to power," that's Adam Smith. So please stay for this interview.
He provided quite the feminist critique of nuclear policy, if I do say so myself.
He was terrific. But before we get to him, we have a couple of other segments.
Yes, so early warning, we are actually going to spend our 7 minutes discussing his remarks about the Defense Authorization Bill and the likelihood that the amendments he has been pushing, that whether or not they'll make it into the final bill.
And then we have another Ask Joe segment. We have a question from Mark from Massachusetts. I haven't heard it yet. I'm looking forward to it.
But as always, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share if you like what you hear.
But our clock is ticking. Let's go to the news.
And now, early warning. Early warning. Early warning. Early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome back to this very special edition of Early Warning. I'm your host, Michelle. Last week, Representative Adam Smith, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, spoke at the Ploughshares Fund's briefing on the future of U.S. nuclear policy. And you'll hear some of his remarks in the second part of this episode. But first, we wanted to spend these 7 minutes talking about Smith's comments around the Defense Authorization Bill, which is likely in the final weeks of negotiations. So joining me today to discuss this are Mary Kaszynski, Deputy Director of Policy, and Geoff Wilson, Political Director at Council for a Livable World. Welcome back.
Thank you, Michelle.
So our 7 minutes starts now. Chairman Smith said that it will be very, very difficult to get the amendment related to cutting the new low-yield nuclear weapon into the final bill. And based on these remarks and other public statements, it sounds like the Democratic House's leadership's priority is 1, passing a bill, and 2, making sure that bill restricts any funding from being used for the border wall. Mary, why is this the suite of priorities, and what does it mean for the other amendments?
Sure. So the National Defense Authorization Act sets not only the budget numbers, but also the defense policy for the entire year. And that's really why it's important to get this bill passed. That's the entire purpose of the Armed Services Committee. Now, there are a lot of different competing interests here, a lot of different stakeholders. Defense contractors want the bill passed because they want the money to go, they want their contracts to go forward, they want the money. Chairman Smith wants the bill to go forward because it's his bill. He's now the chair of this committee. The Defense Authorization Bill has passed for like 58 straight years. He doesn't want to be the one to drop the ball on this.
Right. And I think it's important to note here that this budget is bigger than peak levels of defense spending that were reached during the Korean and Vietnam wars, right? This is a lot of money. It's more money than President Trump even initially asked for. He asked for
just outrageous.
Yeah, he asked for $718 billion, at which point Republicans in the Senate said, no, that's definitely not enough money, right? We got to spend more on defense. They wanted $750 billion, okay, even more money. Democrats said, let's compromise. We will spend $733 billion. But at the same time, we're going to put forward these progressive provisions that they felt were necessary to safeguard the nations, both from this administration's worst impulses, but also to clarify key national security priorities, like, for instance, the prohibition of deploying new and, quote, more usable nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal. So important progressive national security doctrines, right?
So what you're saying is we may be faced with a situation in which there is one of the largest defense authorization bills we've ever seen, but it has none of the priorities that many progressive members fought for and were the reasons that they agreed to vote for this.
Right. The scary thing is that even at $733 billion, Republicans in the Senate have said this is a non-starter. Right. This isn't enough money, that the things that are in this bill are completely outrageous and shouldn't be included. At which I think, and I know that Adam Smith agrees with this, he said, it's not like you can make the argument that we're not spending enough on defense here, right? But these political issues have become a problem. And like Mary said, we have passed NDAAs bipartisanly for 58 straight years. This really is a sign of the times of just how divided this government has gotten, I think.
Right, exactly. Well, and Michelle, you make a really good point about the vote count. So Senate Republicans are threatening to introduce the skinny NDAA, which sets the top line number, it provides authorization for all the current programs, but it doesn't include any of these progressive priorities. In the House, however, the vote margin between Republicans and Democrats is so small that potentially the bill could go through with just Republican votes and a few Democrats. Politically, that should be a non-starter for Democrats. They have control of the House now. They have a lot of leverage to include these important policy guardrails against an administration that's quite clearly out of control, that can't be trusted with nuclear weapons, that's threatening to start war with Iran. So this is a really key moment. It's an important opportunity for Democrats to start reining in an out-of-control defense budget, to put some guardrails on the Trump administration, prevent the president from starting a nuclear war, prohibit unauthorized military action against Iran. These are some of the important issues that if Democrats stick together, they can include in the defense bill.
Right. And Mary made a really important point at the beginning of this, right, which is the purpose of the Armed Services Committee, the purpose of this Defense Authorization Act is to set policy, to set strategy. Appropriators, the appropriations committees can appropriate money for things, okay? It is the purpose of this bill to set what the funding priorities are, what the strategy is for the next fiscal year, where a lot of these weapon systems, these big budget things are going to be developed, implemented and deployed, and what the strategy is for their use. This skinny bill that's being talked about that would just sort of be a continuing resolution for defense. It would just pay for things like military pay raises, things that are important, but that would have none of these policy provisions in them. We don't want ambiguity when it comes to $733 billion in funding. There's already so much waste, fraud, and abuse in this that we fear about. But at the same time, when it comes to the strategy of whether or not we deploy a more usable nuclear weapon, that's something I don't want any ambiguity about.
Well, and this is all happening in the context of the impeachment inquiry. Right. So Trump is already unstable and untrustworthy. He has limitless control over the nation's nuclear weapons. And Congress is potentially poised to give him a new, more usable nuclear weapon if they don't put in this policy prohibition in the NDAA.
Well, and I think you've now also answered my question about why this is a must-pass bill. If, as you said, the appropriators can do, the appropriations, right, but really creating these policy guardrails is the point of it. And so really it sounds like they're fighting for their own existence in that sense.
That's exactly right. Chairman Smith is fighting for a lot here. There's a lot on the line. There's the existence of the Armed Services Committee, the future of that committee itself. There are the policy, the national security strategy for the rest of the year. There's an opportunity to stop this new nuclear weapon, to stop war with Iran. These are some really important, essential questions that we're facing right now.
Geoff, you get the final 15 seconds. Any last words?
Look, the chairman's right. This is a lot of money. Okay, there should be no ambiguity. Democrats fought hard to include guardrails against the president's worst impulses. And the fact is that every American citizen should be concerned that we're about to spend $700+ billion that doesn't have a clear strategy or priority to it.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much.
Letters, we get letters, we get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now it's time for our Q&A segment, in which I give Joe a question he has never seen before.
I'm blindfolded. I've been in a glass booth. No, not really, but I haven't seen the question yet.
No, and so today's question is from Mark from Massachusetts. Thank you, Mark. And here it is. It feels like we're entering into this period of renewed rivalry with Russia, except the competition is less head-on and more indirect than it was during the Cold War. Do you agree? And how do we win? Win in quotes.
Well, as Ronald Reagan said, a nuclear war can never be won, so it must never be fought. And those are wise words. And so it's true. So much of our nuclear policy is still shaped by these Cold War doctrines about how you win a nuclear war, how you have to control every step of the escalatory ladder. So therefore, if they have a certain kind of weapon, we have to have a certain kind of weapon to match it. And that is exactly the dynamic you see now. In fact, the whole debate that we discussed later in this episode about a low-yield nuclear weapon is precisely this Cold War strategy about how we have to win at deterrence, how we have to be able to have a weapon that can respond in kind should the Russians use a nuclear weapon first, or we have to be able to have a small usable nuclear weapon so that we can have a manageable nuclear war. This is all nonsense. This is all nonsense, but it still pervades the nuclear establishment. Mark says it's somewhat indirect. I understand what you mean, because Russia is not the Soviet Union. The leaders of Russia are no longer the center of a vast international communist party apparatus. They don't control parties and others. But it's not that different. Instead of communist parties, the Russians are spreading their influence into the new authoritarian parties that you see in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, with direct donations. So this confrontation against the West that Putin is running is pretty direct. And the nuclear weapons, they're pretty direct. He is, once again, deploying weapons in Europe. He is building new missiles directly to try to get around any possible missile defense system we could build. So there is a direct response. We make a move, he makes a move. He makes a move and we say, we have to respond to that. And who went first is lost in this vicious escalatory cycle. So it's not at the levels of the Cold War. We used to have 36,000 nuclear weapons. Now we have about 6, same for Russia. But the dynamic is still the same. We still haven't broken the Cold War logic. We still haven't broken the Cold War doctrines. There is no way to win this except not to play.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Mark. Welcome to a special interview segment that we're doing with Chairman Adam Smith, Democrat from Washington State and the leader of the House Armed Services Committee. I'm Joe Cirincione, as president of Ploughshares, and we welcomed Adam Smith to the National Press Club last week to meet with our board and major donors and the Washington national security community. He took the podium before a packed audience, standing room only, and he shared his thoughts with us before sitting down with me for a follow-up discussion. He made some news in his remarks, and you'll hear that at the end of this interview, where he disclosed that he thought it was unlikely that the Defense Authorization Bill would come back to the House with any of the key provisions that the House had passed, including the prohibition on a new, more usable nuclear weapon. But I want to walk you through his remarks piece by piece, because he really lays out the overview of why he thinks so much of our nuclear policy is irrational, even insane. Take a listen.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate all of the work that you are doing. And the work towards that goal is really just beginning. I think we had a lot of success in 2018, obviously, in the elections, and I think are putting out the right arguments. But make no mistake about it, the president, the Senate, and a lot of people, even bipartisan people, are not totally sympathetic at this point to the viewpoint that we need to reduce our dependence on nuclear weapons and take a different approach. So we've got a lot of work left to do. I'm very proud of the bill that we passed off of the House floor for a lot of reasons, but certainly the statements it made about this issue, I think, are incredibly important. Opposing the deployment of a low-yield nuclear weapon, urging increased dialogue between the U.S., Russia, and China as the major nuclear powers in the world on how to make sure we deconflict and avoid stumbling into a nuclear war, and also just questioning the entire nuclear posture review and the need to spend the amount of money that they're talking about over the time period that they're talking about. That was a good step. The Senate doesn't agree with us, in case you were wondering. So we're going to work through that, but it is really important to continue to advance the argument, because we're at a very dangerous point right now. We are in an arms race that almost has no sort of control at the moment. Russia is increasing its nuclear arsenal. We are sprinting to try and respond to that. And as near as I can tell, nobody is talking about the danger of that and how to control it. And I think that is the first and most important step that we can take, is to open up lines of communication between the US, Russia, and China about the importance of having arms control agreements when it comes to nuclear weapons and the delivery vehicles for them. That was something that was started, in the Cold War between the US and Soviet Union, and I think was crucial in making sure that we changed calculations so that nobody thought that starting a nuclear war was a good idea. Those dialogues need to be restarted. And that's really one of the huge dangers of the low-yield nuke, is it starts the conversation of a manageable nuclear war. There is no such thing. Once you've stepped over that line, you've created a situation where the Earth is literally in jeopardy. So we need to start that dialogue. And then also, I think we need to strongly make the case to rethink the nuclear posture review. And this is a bipartisan challenge. As many of you know, the Obama administration, they put out the nuclear posture review that called for the $1.2 trillion over some period of time to upgrade our nuclear arsenal. And there are a lot of false assumptions contained in the determination that there was a need for that type of expansion. And of course, the Trump administration has only taken it further in some of the things that they're doing. I think there is a very powerful argument to be made for taking a different approach. For not relying on so many nuclear weapons. And basically, I always cite China as the primary example. They have less than 300 nuclear weapons, but they have a very clear policy. We have enough weapons that if you existentially threaten us, we can cause you a massive amount of pain. So don't. And I think it's a pretty effective policy. And frankly, it enables them to spend more money on other aspects of their defense and national security. And I think we would benefit from looking at that model and figuring out how to have a more manageable nuclear arsenal. Now, make no mistake about it, we need to update our nuclear weapons. We need to have an adequate deterrent. The weapons are old, but we don't need to have as many as we have historically had. So I think we need to change the nuclear posture review, engage in dialogue, and think about our broader policies. The no first use bill that we've put out is, again, a way to signal to the world that we do not consider nuclear weapons to be an acceptable policy.
The problem for Chairman Smith, and for many of us, is that many in Washington do consider nuclear weapons and their use acceptable policy. Washington is filled with panels talking in great pretentious detail about why we need a nuclear weapon for every possible contingency. Big, small, fast, slow, air, land, sea, space. It is endless. But before you give these discussions too much weight in your graduate class or your congressional hearing, listen to this part of Smith's remarks where he tells us what he thinks of these debates.
This is all nonsense. It is all an excuse to build more and more and more and more. It really, at the end of the day, is a lack of imagination, because aside from the military-industrial complex piece of this, there is also this sort of insecurity that, well, we have to spend more money. As long as we're spending more money, as long as we're building bigger weapons, then we're fine, right? No, it's more complicated than that, and we ought to get in to that level of complication. Side note, but missile defense. We've been arguing for a lot of years that, we're wasting money on a variety of missile defense programs. And whatever we say about missile defense, the Republican response is we need to spend more, almost irrespective of what we're spending it on. And it just turned out here a few months ago, and Leonore, you know the details of this far better than I do, but one of these systems turned out to, well, not work. And we spent an enormous amount of money on it to build a lot of defense weapons that didn't work, which is why we didn't want to spend the money on them. But the mentality was, well, yeah, we just got to spend the money, because if we spend the money, we'll look tough and everything will be fine.
I then asked Chairman Smith what he would advise the next president of the United States. If a new president were to walk into the Oval Office in January 2021, what would Smith's advice be to him or to her on what the nuclear posture of the United States should be? What changes would be required?
Have an arsenal that is, first of all, reliable, without question, and large enough to deter our adversaries, and have that be the focus. Well, what do we need to have to make sure that we deter our adversaries from ever thinking that it's okay to use a nuclear weapon? And by the way, I didn't talk about this in my opening remarks, but aside from Russia, China, and the US, proliferation is a major issue. And we've also sort of stepped back from our efforts to stop proliferation, as Turkey is now muttering about how they'd like to develop a nuclear weapon. Now, we would really, first of all, need to re-engage our diplomatic corps, which has just been completely gutted over the last 3 years. And that has impacts that go far beyond what he explained short, and engage on that issue. But in terms of the weapon systems that we need, yes, we need to upgrade the systems, and we need to truly test them. I was out at Los Alamos a couple weeks ago, last week, 2 weeks, something like that. And, without question, we need, but I think also there's a lot of assumptions about what's not working. And in fact, it may still be working. So let's test that and rely on that. So it needs to be, and also we simply don't need, in my view, 4,000 to 5,000 nuclear weapons. So you can look at the ICBMs, have a defendable force and figure out how you can save money on it. And I think there's a lot of places to save money and have, at the end of the day, fewer nuclear weapons and fewer platforms and still meet our needs.
I then asked Chairman Smith if he had a number in mind. How many nuclear weapons did he think a nation needs to field? And do we need a new nuclear posture review to arrive at that weapon? His answer was very candid. Smith talks about going down from our current arsenal of about 2,000 fielded strategic nuclear weapons to something like 400 or 500, a dramatic drop, and that we should consider cutting or maybe even eliminating the intercontinental ballistic missile force. Here he is discussing these issues.
Yeah, I think so. There have been a number of studies. I think General Cartwright had a study that said something like, 500 delivery vehicles would be more than enough, and laid out exactly why. I think the place to start on all of this is on the ICBM discussion. And actually, there was a study I saw somewhere talking about how, because right now we're in the middle of doing the GBSD. Just had to figure out
ground-based strategic deterrent,
the new ICBM.
Yes.
And by the way, it's now going to be a sole source contract because Boeing's out of it. But as we're looking at that, there is plenty of argument that we can extend the life of the existing ICBMs if we rely on fewer Part of the problem, part of the reason that we need the new thing is they insist on having, I forget the number, 450, 500, something like that, when in fact we probably could have an adequate deterrent from that at a lower number that would not require us to build a brand new missile.
This issue of contractor influence on the procurement process got us back to the discussion of the low-yield nuclear weapon. So I asked Chairman Smith how much of this debate on this and the other weapons is driven by ideology and how much by contractor interest.
Well, that's kind of a chicken and egg question to a certain extent, because the message that is out there is what I said earlier, whatever it is, it has to be more. I read David Stockman's book, The Triumph of Politics, and he talked about how he never could get the defense budget shrunk because Cap Weinberger would always come in and he'd have this chart that had like a really big, strong-looking soldier, which represented his defense budget. And this weak little guy over here in the corner, there was David. Now, which budget? Which one would you want? Come on. And to some extent, that's the message that is driven. More is better. Spend more money. Be tougher. Be stronger. Have more. Now, that message is compelling to a lot of people who, are nervous and just want to be reassured. But that message is driven in large part by contractors who want them to believe that so that then they will give them money. So it's both. It's both that parochial interest and then people buying into the argument that parochial interest very cleverly makes. And this is also a problem on the ICBMs because Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, where they are, they're for whatever reason, they're fond of their missiles. Apparently, they want to be targeted in a first nuclear strike. I know they don't. They want the jobs. It can't be that many jobs attached to silos. But anyway, so the pushback we get is from those states. In fact, one of the most bizarre things was there was an amendment when the Republicans controlled the Armed Services Committee that was added to the bill in committee that said that the Pentagon cannot even think about reducing the number of ICBMs in our arsenal. I had to ask on the phone, how are you going to enforce that? You got some guy sitting in the corner of the Pentagon going, what if we only did 300? No, you're in violation of the law. But that's how paranoid they are about it. They don't want any reduction at all, no matter the circumstances, and that's not rational. It's parochial.
The effort to cut the low-yield warhead is one of the leading contentious issues between you and the Senate. What do you think the odds are that you will prevail? I mean, is it roughly the odds of the Nationals winning the World Series, or is it worse than that?
It's roughly the odds of the Seattle Mariners winning the World Series. Let's put it that way. And by the way, that was the first thought that I had when I saw that the Nationals were going to the World Series. It is now official. The only Major League Baseball team that has never been to the World Series is the Seattle Mariners.
Yes, the only one. So, yeah. We could turn this into a sports talk.
Yeah. So in all seriousness, that's going to be very, very difficult.
Yes.
Very difficult because of the strong opposition from both the White House and the Senate.
As Michelle, Mary, and Geoff said at the beginning of this podcast, you have to sympathize with the difficult position Adam Smith is in. He clearly cares deeply about these issues. He convinced his Democratic colleagues to vote for a funding bill that many thought excessive because of the important policies attached to the funding. But now it appears that the Senate Democrats are willing to block with the Senate Republicans and the administration and strip all this language out, leaving only the money. If the Senate Democrats vote this week for the skinny, that is, pure money, NDAA, they will completely undercut Smith and their House colleagues. So then what does Smith do? If he passes this policy-free bill back in the House with mainly Republican votes, he betrays the Democratic caucus and the policies he believes in. If he refuses to bring such a bill back to the House, he risks losing the only legislation that gives his committee power. Does he call the Senate's bluff? After all, without a bill, the Senate Armed Services Committee loses power too, and the campaign donations that come with that power. If this sounds to you like the military procurement system is broken, corrupted by money, and that the constitutional authority of the U.S. Congress to provide for the common defense has been eroded, you have an accurate read of the situation. All this is going to play out in November, with the final resolution likely in December. It is a high-stakes game of nuclear policy chicken. We will be there to cover it. Stay tuned.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, Alex Spire, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.